Hello, magicians, weavers of spells, lyrical muses of life. Poetry is musing, and everybody muses. We tend to ostracize the poet and point our fingers at him and say, look at that dude over there, he's so far out there. He's so eccentric. He behaves so unusually, and yet I hope throughout the course of this video to persuade the viewer that poetry is a perfectly natural activity, and that the poet does nothing but to carry out the tendency of his thought as it happens perfectly spontaneously, and that there's a simplicity of expression which pervades most poetic activity. And the word muse, part of its etymology is from the Old French muser, Old French meaning to ponder or dream or meditate, and also quite notably, if you look up the Old French muser, one of the definitions is to waste one's time. And I thought that was quite significant. That is, there's the notion inherent in the very word muse, to muse, that it is a waste of one's time, and that one could be doing more productive, more fruitful activities, and that there are better ways to spend one's time, and that these quote-unquote better ways have nothing to do with dreaming or considering the profundities of life and imagining things and playing around with the childish way of thinking and considering things, because there is a childlike motif which corresponds to the naturalness I was saying earlier about poetry that pervades poetry. And there is a simplicity of expression akin to that of the child, that while one may have a poetic thought and spoken to anybody else it would sound utterly nonsensical, there's a certain rightness to it in the solitude of one's own consciousness. Just a certain fancy or a certain notion occurs to you, a certain grouping of words, a rhyme, a melody, what have you, and there's just an intrinsic and unexplainable rightness to it. And elephant in the room, which the poet is aware of and addresses, but that most people tend to brush off, is the consideration where our thoughts come from. St. Augustine, the old Roman Church father and Christian theologian, asked God not to hold him accountable for his dreams, because they were so absurd and so embarrassing that to think that he is the one who forges and creates them warrants, he thought, much shame. And I think we can all relate to this, that we don't want to be, we don't want to know ourselves as the creators of our own dreams, because, let's be perfectly frank, they can be quite ridiculous, and almost as a rule, they are. Well, our thoughts, for whatever reason, in everyday life, don't seem as ridiculous as dreams, and we seem more or less to be the arbiters of them and to mold our thoughts to some degree or other. And even this, I would say, is it deserves to be challenged. And for example, people who have ever experimented with meditation, people who have taken psychedelics, but I'll go with meditation to begin with, recognize a certain involuntariness, an involuntary happening to the activity of thought itself, that if you just sit back and don't try to do anything, to add anything to your experience or to the totality of existence, but just perfectly let what happens happen of itself, let history just basically play its own game and roll its own wheel, what happens is you're not trying to do anything at all. You're in a totally passive state. Nevertheless, your thinking continues. Do you recognize that you aren't necessarily the creator of your thoughts, and while you may have some ability to direct them, the mere activity, just its basic happening at all, is perfectly spontaneous and natural. And I assure you, you don't have to be somebody who has practiced much sitting meditation to be able, just for a moment, to stop and to just see what happens when you don't try to do anything at all. And you will find that thoughts that have a certain regularity, like our heartbeat, our breathing, the growth of our bodies, our hair, I don't know if I said blinking, the sounds of the birds chirping now, everything around me. It's all of these things which I am so aware that I did nothing to create these facts or processes. They just happened. That's quite like what thought is, and yet it is such a prevalent assumption that we are the authors of all of our thoughts. And I think that really maturity entails that we learn one day we aren't totally the creators of our thoughts, in the same way that St. Augustine didn't want to be known as responsible for producing his dreams. There are days where we have thoughts and feelings so ridiculous that to think that we are the ones, as individuals, who gave rise to these ugly and confusing and scrambly and incoherent thoughts and feelings, it actually makes us feel quite guilty. And why would we come up with that? There's all of these better thoughts and feelings that we could have come up with, and yet there's just this random, disharmonious, and ugly thought that has occurred to me. And to think that I created it, it gives rise to some kind of shame and a kind of mental cramp. And this is what Jung, with his theory of the unconscious, well, it's not his theory, but just the gist of his teaching to mankind, was to get people again to see their thoughts as natural occurrences and as the products and issuances of nature itself. That sure, it is possible for us to direct our thoughts in some or other ways, but thought is, as Jung himself put it, an autonomous phenomenon. It autonomos, having laws of its own, occurring of itself, and that's quite what it is. And I think that it's so valuable, that insight of just appreciating the regularity of thought in the same way that we appreciate the regularity of our heartbeat. Both of them just happen. Now, is probably a lot harder to control our heartbeat, though I don't doubt that some people are able to do so, than to manipulate our thoughts. There is this experience of writing poetry, which is so curious, and I've found it, even apart from writing, just the poetic activity of the mind itself, even if you don't have pen and paper on hand, that the composition of poetry, I think, at least this is how I understand it, is self-composing. That in the same way that we don't get to decide not to think anymore, the poet doesn't really have a say in what it is he is going to compose. Just, he gives freedom to that activity of his poetic thought, and it's totally self-authoring and self-composing. I may cite Nietzsche a couple times in this video, but in his Ecce Homo, I think it's section 3 in his chapter on his book of Zarathustra, he describes the experience of poetic inspiration, and he says that the words or phraseology that occurs to one is in the utmost involuntary, but accompanied by the highest sense of freedom. And he said he didn't doubt that one would have to go back thousands of years to come across somebody able to say that his experience of inspiration is just the same as that. And that's kind of his indirect way of saying that you'd have to go back thousands of years to find true poets. Though he was a fan of Hölderlin in his younger years, and I don't doubt that he had maybe a couple of other modern poets that he enjoyed to read. But there is, in our day, this preoccupation with constricted sort of thinking and just logical, literal, rational, all of that type of thought which one is not ashamed to say, I made this, and this is mine, I abide by these statements, and check them with your reason and they will make sense to you. Whereas the poets of old, say the ancient tragedians of Greece or Homer himself, if you read any of their books, even simply the English translations, you will find, likely, unless you have done a lot of reading, and even then, I think you may still run into the struggle of not being able to comprehend much of what they say and what's going on in their stories. I certainly had a hard time reading the Oresteia trilogy in the English rendition some years back, and there is an experience of reading a text which you cannot understand very easily, which nevertheless enriches your imagination and evokes imagery that without those words presented to you would not be able to occur unless randomly, which the odds of that are very much less than if you are exposed to the words of these books. And there is an experience of reading poetry, but there's an experience of writing or composing poetry. Die Poesie ist ein Heimgehen. And that's a German phrase I came up with in thinking about this video beforehand. And it means poetry is a homegoing. And I believe I said at the outset of the video that we tend to point our fingers at the poet and look at him as a separate breed. But maybe the poet has situated himself into what we all are, and I think it's incredible that each of us, merely as a human being, is engaged in thought every single day, and I think we should be under no illusions that thought itself is a visionary activity. And poetry does nothing but to amp that up and to return it to its childhood grace, as it were. That all of us are engaged in constant musing, reading of our situations, finding ourselves in different times and places. And in all of it, to mention Jung again, he says that at the most basic level, of the experience of reality, there are psychic animisms or animistic assumptions, and anima, Latin word for soul. There is all in our experience of every particular thing and the whole thing. There are experiences of certain souls. And to the layman, such a statement sounds utterly crazy, and yet to somebody who has looked into himself, it is plain as day. And he has a word that he uses in certain of his collected works, feeling tone. That is no different than these animistic assumptions. There's certain feeling tones to, for example, my experience of the birds flying around right now, and the trees, and to my dog laying on the floor, to my pipe on the table itself, all of them have their soul, if you will. And the poet, his genius lies in a capacity to express these souls. And it is this that we have denied in the modern world for an allegedly scientific standpoint, which I don't think is comprehensively scientific, and that by excluding the mysterious, the dreamy, the aesthetic, the poetic, by excluding those data of reality, we are deceiving ourselves as to reality and leaving out another half of it, the half of the unknown and what we don't see. That this is done by our fixation on the quote-unquote purely physical, the hard facts. That you don't have to be such a quirky and unusual person to be a poet. All it takes is to not lose connection to that profound and mysterious side of life, which as children, very imaginative, we were very much in touch with. The eyes for splendor, I think, as I've called it before. That being able to see whatever that is a kind of superpower which, if supposing you didn't have it, you wouldn't read into the souls of what you experience in life and be deprived of what used to be known as religious experience and was the fount of all religiosity. That really this could be an etiological, that is a causal explanation of many a neurosis in our time. Really, I think we must take this more seriously, that there may be a religious explanation for why people today wind up in therapy or taking pharmaceuticals they don't need to be taking. I mean, certainly in my life, something like that has been the case, because I had been, hypochondriac, and self-diagnosing myself with, say, ADHD and depression and anxiety and maybe bipolar disorder, perhaps even schizophrenia, and just going off the list in my head, that until I began to have experiences, or maybe have permitted myself to have such experiences, I don't really play the whole self-diagnosing game anymore. I think it's bullshit. That if any of you have read the Emerald Tablets of Hermes Trismegistus, I perceive a certain truth to it, and yet read to any contemporary scientific type, it would just register as absolute mumbo jumbo. And yet, the spokesman of basically all religiosities all adhere to the statement that Hermes' revelation was authentic and that it conveys a certain truth to life or to history. And Hermes was a seer of life. Menevo, Greek word for to translate or interpret. Menevs, translator or interpreter. That's really the poetic game. I mean, if you just take those two words, translator, interpreter, think about poetry as you perform it, maybe unwittingly at the moment, but now I'm disclosing it to you. How you perform this already, with or without your knowing it. We all translate and interpret, in a sense, our situations in life that we find ourselves in. We're always reading into these small animistic realities of Carl Jung's thought. That poetic experience is a certain return to home, to the domus originalis, another term. That's Latin that I came up with in thinking about this video. Something about home really conveys what to me is poetic experience. And there's a young French author, Arthur Rimbaud, and there's this preface to this short poetic book that he made. He himself was a pretty outstanding and I want to say I have heard belligerent young fellow, but he compiled a great deal of poetic work at a very young age. Early 20s, he had already had a whole oeuvre. And I can't remember where exactly he says it, but I want to say it's just in an essay of a preface to that book, Illuminations. He said that where before he started to look and see only clouds, he began to see gold chariot of the sky. And I think that this is a visual accomplishment that we were capable of as children quite easily, that we didn't really have to think to see into these, if you will, higher realities and truer visions. We just did so, but in adulthood, especially in our day, in a very literalistic and materialistic and, as it were, coarse age, it almost requires premeditation to see into these greater visions of life and the being able to perceive these imaginative and spiritual facts and realms and all that stuff. That you can regain that capacity and not lose your scientific concern and your engagement with the hard facts and the sociological facts and environmental facts of your life, all of that remains the same. But you have this sort of superpower of childlikeness and a certain lively play with the reality you inhabit, and not seeing it narrowly and reducing it, because this is something I'm learning from authors I've read in the past year or so more and more. It's just brilliant and amazing how much they say it, that all of them are in agreement that we reduce our reality, and that, I mean, as I was saying with thought earlier, that's just one of the things that strikes me most. We treat that as less than a visionary reality. Same with words. Words are visions. And I find more and more, I haven't said it yet, but I myself have composed a lot of poems. And I find the more that I experiment with words, and the more that I think more on certain problems and just consider certain things and raise the question mark here and there, that words just become bottomless to me in their meanings and where they've been and how each of them individually have behaved in literature, how they could behave. My mind just begins to go off the rails, and if I were to just die today and somebody came across my phone, they would find in my photo album thousands of words from Google Dictionary and their etymologies and showing their structures, and at the bottom it gives a little description of their definitions and how they've evolved. That wow, man, words are so alive, and we overlook this so much. And you know, I don't blame people for it, but all I'm saying is that maybe a due respect given to words and our trying to learn them again and understand them again, they give you the capacity to transcend the complications one would experience in life with a narrowness of usage in words. That once the depth and profundity of all words is grasped, one can begin to learn more about what it is to be human. Because, don't get me wrong, or be under no illusion, rather, words see, I just lost that thought. Fuck. Oh, I got it. See? Came in handy that time. This unconscious mind of mine. Words are banks of experiences. I mean, if you just learn a new word and really try to comprehend the definition as much as you can, it takes you through an experience, and you, if you pay attention, get to see a vision play out somewhere within your consciousness. I don't know where exactly, of the definition of that word, and it takes on a certain livingness. And okay, you have to learn the particularity of that livingness. And thus, by learning words and definitions, you are truly training yourself to see, and thus giving yourself the capacity to see the more rightly in life when, say, you're experiencing trouble and are unsure about yourself and perhaps even the world and life altogether. If you can have that capacity to see well and be able to see into that splendor of life, as was so easy for us as children, and exercise your inventive capacity and play with thought a little bit to the betterment of yourself and the world around you, that nobody will ever tell it to you, but if you can only try to shape up your thinking and not succumb to your lesser natures and your lesser thoughts, I mean, that to me is as good as it gets. You're saving the world as an individual. You're not becoming rotten, and believe me, it's certainly possible for people to become rotten. One might say you see it more and more. That if you don't become that person, but you, in a sense, retain your innocence and your kinship with capital T truth, that I think that some people will tell you that you need an institution or a doctrine to be your absolute standpoint of truth, but I think at the end of the day, all of us have it, or could have it, in our own solitude, and that there is a certain sense and sanity that we all have perfectly on our own doing what we do, and we can be alone and with ourselves and be content and peaceful. Some people it's not the case, and they do need some external thing or group and all that to validate themselves and to make them feel like they're on the right path, doing the right things. But some people don't require that and are aware that they perform the daily motions like any other person, but have continued to think for themselves and to try themselves to learn to read reality more closely and to see into its riches and brilliances. And it's so easy and so natural. It's unbelievable. And I think that this is something like what Carl Jung was teaching with his psychology, though it's people have criticized it as being very obscure. But in a nutshell, we are individuating creatures, and the psyche has a teleological function of advancing toward what he called the self. And so telos, meaning goal, Greek word. We are creatures who are continuing to become creatures as we advance in the future, and in the process of so doing, we have visionary experiences of perfection, wholeness, what religious man, antique man, called God. And I think that all of us perhaps have this experience each in our own way, whether or not we'll even use the word God to explain it away, or whatever we do about interpreting and explaining the experience itself is still there, perhaps, for all of us. And Jung tried to show how the symbol of the self, the circle, the mandala, would show up in dreams. And yet, I think that this experience is just as real for people in the daytime as well. For me, it has certainly been more in the daytime. I actually don't remember very many of my dreams at night at all. And this is also quite like what Abraham Maslow was pointing out with his peak experiences. There is this exalted state of understanding and unity and connection and, if you will, self-transcendence, a direct occupation with ultimate reality. It's something so beyond the ordinary, so extraordinary, that unforgettable experience and changes your personality quite of necessity. And so you have this self-archetype throttling the individuation process, thus we're becoming more comprehensive, more full, more perfect creatures in our connection to this experience. And some people lose their connection to that experience, and that's why Jung with his psychology was trying to restore that connection in his patients, to execute what he called a religious function in the patients, which now I see speaks a lot to what I was saying before about people maybe needlessly going to therapy and taking pharmaceutical drugs because they have lost their engagement with that, what Jung himself would call numinous or religious or spiritual or aesthetic reality. Just all of those extraordinary types of reality that I think there's a phase early in life when we're so intimately bound with that side of life and so inextricable from it. We're just totally there. And then we grow up, we get immersed in this literalistic and modern and sober and boo-boo and hard facts. We're not softies like the men of old. You know, in this age, this irreligious age, and anti-cultural, anti-aesthetic, we tend to lose engagement with that side of reality, and we don't see very many other people trying to return to it, and so we think it's just a nonsensical and unneeded thing to do to regain connection with that side of life. And I think it is important that we do regain that connection, and poetry is certainly a way there, and it's a way which requires nobody but yourself. I mean, it may add to your experience of composing poetry to have learned some words beforehand and to have picked up the dictionary and just exposed yourself to new words with new definitions that you have still to learn. Just do that and then allow your mind to play with these new words and phrases, and it will, I think, if you allow it to. This is what I was saying before about thought being an autonomous activity with a regularity that We don't have to try to begin to think, it just happens. Poetry is just the same. Poetic ingenuity and inventiveness it's just so spur of the moment, and it requires no effort or will at all. It's just allowing the poetic phenomena to arise perfectly of themselves has been my experience, and it's apparently Nietzsche's as well, and just so many others. So I think I'll wrap it up here because I feel like I'm rambling, but I really love words, and I think that words can be assorted melodically and musically, and I think that we have a very natural and musical engagement with reality as children, and that this may be remembered, and that liveliness and enthusiasm rekindled, and then one does not become a toxic and rotten person. One retains oneself and remains fruitful and contributes to the world, and that because one has kept connection with that, if you will, divine side of life, that very personal and unexplainable side that so important. I think that we maintain connection with it, because it would seem that connection to this divine side of life has a great deal to do with the evolution of our species, and that if there is any hope in our continuing to ascend, and people may argue that we are no longer ascending and that we're on the downtrend from here on out. Whatever you may argue, if we are to ascend as a species ever again, I think, from what I know so far, that such a movement would require our returning to this original and primary seeing of the deeper facts and deeper layers, and not losing our sense and consideration of the possibilities, and that just keeping the genie's bottle open and allowing the mystery of life itself to teach you by way of your thinking and your feeling of life, which I think it does if people, it requires a certain backstep of humility and looking at reality headlong and saying, it didn't begin with me, it's so much bigger than me, and it moves through me. I mean, to think that I am autonomous in this and that I control very much is quite ridiculous. The reality is so much bigger than me, and it determines what I am. And once you come to that acknowledgement, thought and feeling in life just become so much different. They're not any longer your thought or your feeling. They are life's thought and life's feeling. And by looking at them, you learn about life. And I think that's the poet's insight. One of them, at least. And so, before I drag on any longer, thanks for tuning in, guys.